The second I pulled my cruiser into the driveway during that whiteout blizzard, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with the universe, or at least my small corner of it. Snow was piling up a foot high. The wind was screaming like a banshee through the pines, and after spending 12 hours pulling mangled cars out of a pile up on the interstate, all I wanted was to feel the hum of my backup generator and see the lights flickering in my windows. But there was nothing but a dead, cold silence and an empty concrete pad where my $1,200 Westinghouse used to sit, with nothing left behind but some jagged drag marks leading out toward the street. My security system was dark, my house was a literal icebox, and in that moment I realized my brand new neighbor had just stolen the one thing protecting my home while I was out serving the public. 20 minutes later, after following those tracks in the snow, I found her standing in her doorway with her arms crossed, wearing a puffer vest that probably cost more than my truck, watching me with that smug, self-righteous grin that only a certain type of person can pull off while the world is freezing over. She didn't even let me get a word out before she barked that I needed to keep my, in quote, industrial trash, in quote, out of her upscale neighborhood, calling me a, in quote, blue-collar eyesore, in quote, and telling me that if I couldn't in Oppos, afford a silent integrated system, I didn't in Oppos, belong in Blackwood Estates. The metallic taste of pure, unadulterated rage flooded my mouth because she thought I was just some tired guy in a flannel shirt she could push around. Having no clue, she'd just declared war on the one man in this county who had the legal authority to dismantle her life with a single phone call. My name is Miller Vance. I'm 54 years old, and about 6 months ago, the people of Oak Haven County elected me their high sheriff, which was a hell of a climb for a guy who started out walking a beat in the city 30 years ago. I'd just come through a divorce that felt like being dragged behind a freight train. She got the colonial, I got the legal bills, and my 16-year-old daughter, Chloe, was stuck caught in the middle. I moved to this, in quote, modest, in quote, 3-bedroom ranch in Blackwood because I wanted a fresh start where nobody knew my business, somewhere I could just be Miller the neighbor instead of Sheriff Vance the public figure. The house had a detached shop where I could tinker with my old 1994 Bronco, a rusted-out beauty that I loved specifically because it didn't turn heads, and I figured a quiet HOA-managed community was the safest place for a man with my list of enemies. See, when you spend 3 decades putting the worst of the worst behind bars, you don an Oppos. Just retire from the target on your back, and that generator wasn't an Oppos. About, in quote, aesthetics, in quote. It was about keeping my perimeter cameras live and my motion sensors active when the grid inevitably failed. I'd received my fair share of letters from the state pen over the years, especially after I broke a major distribution ring back in Oppos. 22, so having my power cut wasn't an Oppos. Just an inconvenience. It was a security breach. The woman standing in that doorway was Victoria Sterling, the HOA president, a woman who drove a white Range Rover with a license plate that said, in quote, esteemed, in quote, and looked at my Bronco like it was a pile of radioactive waste. We'd met once before, 3 weeks after I moved in, when she clicked across the street in her designer boots to tell me that my, in quote, work attire, in quote, wasn't an Oppos. Consistent with the professional atmosphere of the street, and I just nodded and smiled, not realizing she was already sizing me up as a target. That night in the blizzard, as I stood in the snow looking at her, I tried to be the bigger man, I really did, telling her that the generator was a necessity for my home security and that she had no right to trespass and remove private property. She just laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut through the wind, and told me that per the, end quote, emergency aesthetic guidelines, end quote, the board had passed that morning, any non-integrated external power sources were prohibited during, end quote, community showcase days, end quote, which apparently included the middle of a record-breaking storm because potential buyers might be, end quote, scouting the area, end quote. I went home to a freezing house, wrapped Chloe in 3 layers of wool blankets, and sat by the front door with my service weapon on the table, watching the dark driveway through the window and feeling a cold, calculated fire starting to burn in my chest. The next morning, the sun came out over a world of white, and right on cue, here comes Victoria marching on my driveway with 2 other board members in tow, looking like a low-budget version of a firing squad. She handed me a folder thick with, in quote, violation notices, in quote, totaling nearly $1,500, citing the generator, the unauthorized rust on my Bronco, and even the salt I'd put down on my own walkway because it wasn't an Oppo's, the approved clear melt brand. She told me I had 48 hours to pay or they'd start the lien process on my house. And as I looked at her, I noticed something. She was wearing a very specific, very expensive brand of tactical grade cold weather gear that her husband's firm happened to represent in local government contracts. That was the first thread, the tiny little loose end that my investigator's brain couldn't in Oppo's. Stopped pulling on, and as she walked away, I didn't in Oppo's. Get mad. I got curious. I started small, just pulling the public HOA filings in the last 2 years of meeting minutes. And what I found made my professional quality control instinct scream bloody murder. The board had spent over $200,000 on beautification in the last 18 months, but when I looked at the contractors, a pattern emerged that was so blatant it was almost insulting to my intelligence. Every major project, the new stone entrance, the decorative fountain that didn't end Oppo's, actually work, the expensive LED walkway lighting, had been awarded to a company called, Summit Peak Developments, which was a shell corporation registered to Victoria's husband, Marcus Sterling. But here's the kicker. Marcus wasn't an Oppo's, a licensed contractor. He was a corporate mediator who'd let his business permits expire 5 years ago, meaning every single bit of work done in our neighborhood was unpermitted, uninspected, and technically illegal. I spent the next week doing what I do best, evidence collection, walking the common areas with my phone, snapping high-resolution photos of the professional lighting that was already sparking because the wiring was buried 4 inches deep instead of 18. I checked the community clubhouse pool and found that they'd bypassed the mandatory state safety drainage systems to save 30 grand, creating a literal death trap for any kid who dived in, and the playground equipment they bragged about was missing the structural anchoring bolts required by Oak Haven County safety codes. I wasn't Oppo's, just looking at Karen with a power trip anymore. I was looking at a systematic multi-year fraud scheme that was putting 65 families at physical and financial risk just so Victoria could have a Range Rover and a house full of marble. I tried to give him an out. I really did, because despite everything, I still wanted a quiet life, so I sent a polite, anonymous-ish email to the board email address outlining the discrepancies I'd found and suggesting we waive the fines and fix the safety issues before the county got involved. Victoria's response was a masterpiece of arrogance. She sent a community-wide blast email, not naming me, but making it very clear who she was talking about, calling me a troubled resident with a history of aggression who was trying to extort the board to avoid his legitimate debts. She even went so far as to imply that my lack of a stable career since she still thought I was just some low-level laborer, made me a threat to the peaceful fabric of Blackwood, That was the moment the gloves came off, the moment the sheriff and me took over from the neighbor, and I started making calls to my friends in the fire marshal's office, the building inspector's department, and the State Bureau of Investigation. I didn't in Oppo's, asked for favors. I just reported factual, documented hazards that were a matter of public safety. And when the fire marshal saw the photos of the sparking walkway lights next to the dry pine mulch, he was at the neighborhood entrance in under an hour. By Wednesday afternoon, Blackwood Estates looked like a crime scene, not because of yellow tape, but because there were 6 different white trucks with government seals parked along the curb, and Victoria was out there in the street, screaming at an inspector that he didn't in Oppo's, have the social standing to touch her property. The cascade failure was a thing of beauty to watch from my porch. The pool was condemned on the spot, the playground was fenced off with orange mesh, and the fire marshal ordered the entire electrical grid for the common areas to be cut because of the imminent threat of structure fire, Victoria was losing her mind, and as she saw me sitting there on my porch, sipping a coffee and watching the chaos, she came charging across my lawn, her face a shade of purple I'd only seen in heart attack victims. She started shrieking that I had destroyed the property values, that she was going to sue me into the Stone Age, and that she'd already called her people, in a sheriff department to have me arrested for harassment. I just let her finish, let her get it all out until she was breathless and shaking, and then I slowly stood up, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my heavy brass shield, letting the afternoon sun glint off the Oak County seal. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife as her eyes went from the badge to my face, then back to the badge, and the color drained out her skin so fast I thought she might actually faint on my hibiscus bushes. I told her in my most professional and official voice that I was Sheriff Miller Vance, and that while I had originally moved here for peace and quiet, I was now officially opening a criminal investigation into Summit Peak developments for fraud, grand larceny, and felony endangerment. The emergency HOA meeting on Monday night was the kind of event people in this town will be talking about for 20 years. The community center was standing room only, and you could feel the electricity in the air, a mix of fear, confusion, and bubbling resentment from neighbors who had been bullied for years. Victoria was there, trying to maintain her, composed leader, persona, but she looked like a ghost, her hands trembling as she shuffled a stack of papers while her husband sat next to her, staring at his shoes. She tried to open the meeting by claiming that the temporary setbacks, with the amenities were the result of, government overreach, and personal vendetta by a disgruntled officer, but I didn't oppose to even let her finish the slide deck. I stood up from the back of the room, not in my flannel this time, but in my full Class A uniform, the tan shirt, the stars on the collar, the whole 9 yards, and the sea of neighbors parted like the Red Sea as I walked toward the front. I didn't oppose. Need a microphone. 30 years of commanding scenes gave me all the projection I needed as I laid out the reality of where their monthly dues had actually been going. I showed them the bank transfers, the expired licenses, and the photos of the, safety equipment, that was just painted PVC pipe meant to look like real hardware. I told them about the secret meetings Victoria had held to bypass the $15,000 spending cap, breaking a $60,000 fountain project into 4, consultation fees, to keep the homeowners from being able to vote on it. The room erupted, not into cheers, but into a roar of betrayal. And I watched as neighbors who had been afraid to speak up for years finally found their voices, shouting about their own fines, their own stories of Victoria's, patrols, and the money they'd lost trying to please her impossible standards. By the time the fire marshal and the state auditor stepped up to confirm my findings, Marcus Sterling was already being led out the side door by 2 of my deputies for questioning, and Victoria was slumped in her chair, a broken woman who had realized that her high society, house of cards had just been hit by a Category 5 hurricane. The aftermath was a long, slow process of healing, but the results were undeniable. Victoria and Marcus were hit with a massive civil suit from the homeowners on top of the criminal fraud charges, and they ended up losing the house and the Range Rover just to cover the restitution and legal fees. A new board was elected, headed by a retired schoolteacher who actually cared about things like, community, and, safety, instead of, aesthetics, and the first thing they did was vote to return my generator and issue a formal apology that was hand-delivered to my door. My Bronco is still parked in the driveway, rust and all, and nobody says a word about it because they know that behind that rusted metal is the man who saved their neighborhood from its own worst enemy. But here's the thing that still sits with me, the part that makes me wonder about the world we live in. After everything was said and done, after the safety hazards were fixed and the money was accounted for, there was still a small group of residents who were angry at me. They didn't oppose, care about the fraud or the fire hazards. They were just upset that the prestige, of the neighborhood had been tarnished by the scandal, and they would have preferred to keep living in a dangerous lie than deal with an ugly truth. It made me realize that some people value the image, of safety more than safety itself, and they'd rather be ruled by a polished criminal than protected by a, messy, truth teller. So now I'm asking you, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have kept your head down and paid the fine just to keep the peace and protect your property value? Or would you have burned the whole system down to make it right? Is a, perfect looking, neighborhood worth the price of its soul, or is it our responsibility to look under the hood, even when we know we're going to find something broken. I've seen a lot of, in quote, Karens, in quote, in my time, but Victoria was something different. She was a reminder that power, even the petty power of an HOA, can corrupt a person until they forget that they're dealing with human beings. Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I went too far or if this was exactly the kind of, in quote, neighborhood watch, in quote, Oak Haven County really needs. And if you got your own HOA horror story, I want to hear it, because the only way we stop people like Victoria is by shining a light on the shadows they play in. Don and Oppos, forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because next time I'm going to tell you about the local councilman who tried to, in quote, rezone, in quote, a veteran's farm right into his own pocket. You won in Oppos. Want to miss that one. Stay safe. Look out for your neighbors. And remember, sometimes the guy in the beat-up truck is the only one standing between you and a disaster.